Brought to you by Pfizer.
In this video, you're going to see the future.
U.S. Treasury being higher.
Breaking news. We've got a livestock there.
Hello there, you Awakening Wonders. Thanks for joining me today for a very special episode of Stay Free with Russell Brand. One man stands astride the political landscape like a colossus. It's Donald Trump. But who was the power behind that man? Whose ideas, whose understanding of populism and power and global trends led Trump to the White House? Many would argue it's Steve Bannon, a man that's had a presidential pardon and hasn't given yet a presidential F-U-C-K. This is a fantastic conversation. This is the reason we're on this channel, to explore new alliances that will bring down the establishment. The minute you have people from across the spectrum unifying, it'll be like sort of the opposite of Ghostbusters when they cross the streams. Remember, we got incredible merch available for you, and every single penny we raise goes towards helping vulnerable people, drug addicts, the mentally ill, the people that are crushed by a system that sees humanity simply as fuel. Become an Awakened Wonder. You get to join us live for these videos, as well as meditating weekly, being part of our book club where we look this week at Christianity, mere Christianity to be particular, the brilliant writing of C.S. Lewis, as well as giving you an exclusive video every single week. Now, Bannon, Steve Bannon, is an American media executive. He was involved in the sale of Castle Rock. He's a political strategist. You know what he done for Trump. He worked for Goldman Sachs, for God's sake. He was the White House's the White House's chief strategist for the first 7 months of Trump's administration. You can watch Bannon, Steve Bannon, on Bannon's War Room on Rumble. But first, you got to watch our conversation with Steve Bannon. If you're watching us on YouTube, Steve Bannon, as you know, is a very, very controversial figure. Extremely controversial. So about the first 10 minutes or so, we'll be on YouTube. After that, we're going to have to be in that sweet stream of Freedom Rumble. You are going to hear things you don't agree with. You're going to hear things that inspire you. You'll probably hear things that terrify you. But you will be armed with some facts, and you will determine for yourself what you believe and what you don't believe. Or you'll yield to an establishment that wants to censor you, control you, and shut you down, that abandoned you in 2008 and wants to use fear to keep you compliant. So let's find out what we can learn together with Steve Bannon right now. Steve Bannon, thank you so much for joining me for Stay Free with Russell Brand today.
Thanks for having me, Russell. Big fan of the show.
Thank you. I'm fascinated by you as an individual, and I'm astonished by how your early life gives us insight into what would come to pass. I'm talking about your time as a serviceman in the Navy, your time in finance, your time at Breitbart, and how that's led into permutations of independent media. In a way, we're living amidst perpetual geopolitical crisis, escalating events in the Middle East, a war that would seem to be unwinnable, funded as it is by your nation between Ukraine and Russia. We live in the aftermath of a financial crash that perhaps you understood better than most people, its implications, its impact, how it spelled the end of the kind of moderate neoliberalist politics that preceded it and gave birth to the populist era that we live within now. Your experiences too in Hollywood, I imagine, give you an interesting perspective on the nature and power of culture, soft power as it's commonly referred to now. And at Breitbart, you established, among others, young Yanis, what's the dude's name, Yanis?
Yiannopoulos, I think.
Yeah, that dude. He was unbelievable. And of course, Ben Shapiro.
For a while.
He was pretty extraordinary. And then in our country, PJW, what commonly these figures are understood as right-wing pundits. So now that many of us believe that we're on the precipice of a black swan event, will you tell me, Steve, where you think populism is heading? If you think the left-right, I heard you once say at the Oxford Union that the future would belong to populism. Do you still believe that there's a chance of either left-wing or right-wing populism, or do you feel that a different ideology is about to assert itself? And over the course of our conversation, I hope to get into all of those areas of which you have personal professional experience.
I would say that if you go back and look at the Oxford Union speech, that was a pretty good call. That because the day it was several years later, and it's right-wing populism and left-wing populism. I think the reason is that the oligarchs that particularly control the West have been so over the top in their greed, in their incompetence. Their greed and their incompetence that people are rising up all over. And you see that whether it's the collapse of the Tory party in England, the rise of alternatives for Deutschland in Germany, the rise of the right in Latin America, Central America, and obviously the Trump movement in the United States. So I think it's a combination of their greed and their incompetence. The elites have failed us and they failed themselves, and it's a populist takeover, and it's going to be determined whether it be right-wing populism or left-wing populism.
Yes, it is. And there yet remains a further alternative. I've heard you use the phrase techno-feudalism, and I think that's what many people, wherever they find themselves culturally or politically, fear, is that we're being guided, manipulated, maneuvered, in fact, into a new form of globalism where technological power is utilized to control consciousness, our understanding of the public sphere, to manipulate consent and communication. Can you tell me what you mean by techno-feudalism, how it relates to globalism, and who sits at the top of that baronial class in this model of feudalism?
Well, if you go back even to the Oxford speech, I'm kind of calling out younger people who have had a tendency just to vote for progressive neoliberalism. Right, and really be led by the cultural side, that you're nothing but Russian serfs. You're the equivalent of Russian serfs. You don't own anything, and you're not going to own anything. The triad that controls the deal is really what I call the easy money overlords of Wall Street, or the city of London, or Frankfurt, or Tokyo, Shanghai, but particularly the city of London and in Wall Street. Then you have the corporatists, both the American corporatists, but also the multinational corporatists, and on top of that, you've got what I call the sociopathic tech overlords. And right now we're basically have passed, I think, late stage capitalism, what I would call finance capitalism. I think you saw that was kind of the collapse in 2008. And you've seen the rise since then of what I call techno-feudalism, which is now we're basically going back to almost the Middle Ages in a feudal society where you're a digital serf, right? You're essentially not going to own your own content. You don't own your own digital self. You're going to kind of labor away. And as long as you don't come off of the being an indentured servant or being a serf, you can get along. But once you stray outside this, and you saw a perfect example, and I think it was one of your great awakenings, was during the pandemic, of what you saw about what public health officials did, and kind of the combination of big tech working with big government, and of course the biopharmaceutical industrial complex. That was a perfect example of techno-feudalism. And unless we start to break this by a democratic means, that means the ballot box, and people getting very focused on, after you have victories, of how you start to take apart these apparatuses, then I think this world is really headed to a new dark age.
You're right to a degree, Steve, that the pandemic period elicited and stirred in me, as well as obviously millions of people, a kind of awakening. Prior to that, I'd always been anti-establishment and had assumed that the position of the left was also anti-establishment, that the left was about free speech, the left was about opposing corruption and power, that the left was about opposing war and empowering ordinary individuals, wherever we're from, Britain, France, your country, any of the African nations, to stand up and oppose tyranny, globalism, elitism. Clearly what's changed in the last few years, and I can't help but consider you to be a significant architect in this transition, is what you refer to as economic nativism has become the default position of the working class or blue-collar populations in America. When you talk of economic nativism, Steve, is that at odds with where I've elsewhere heard you talk about Catholicism, Christianity, subsidiarity, and ideas that are plainly, literally, both in terms of their nomenclature, but plainly their ideology, derived from spiritual ideas? How do these two opposing ideas sit together? economic nativism, which, as the name would suggest, is about economics, and the idea that there is something we are aspiring to, that we are people of spirit, that there are values that transcend materialism and materialism in all its forms. There are the restrictions that rationalism necessarily. I can see your answers ready, Steve. I'm watching your body language, but I'm just going to keep talking. So tell me, that ultimately, aren't you saying let the market sort shit out? I don't really care about the Christianity, or are there real ideals behind this? Now, before we leave YouTube, I want to let you know that if you were on Awake and Wonder, you could have seen this conversation a week earlier. It's been up on Locals for a week now. We also do meditations and a book club and exclusive videos. We are building a movement that is very powerful. So if you're watching us on YouTube, click the link in the description, get over to Rumble, join us there.